Just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, on the 7th of July, 1865, 4 soldiers walked a 42-year-old woman across a prison yard in Washington toward a scaffold that had been built the day before. The temperature in that yard was close to 100 degrees. The woman wore black, a black dress, a black bonnet, a black veil. She could barely stand, and 2 soldiers held her up by the arms. A 3rd soldier did something that nobody who stood in that yard ever quite got over. He held an umbrella over her head to keep the sun off the woman the United States Army was about to hang. Her name was Mary Surratt. She ran a boarding house 10 blocks from Ford's Theater, where Abraham Lincoln had been shot 11 weeks earlier. In the pocket of the general commanding that yard was an execution order approved by the new president, Andrew Johnson. And in a file at the War Department sat a second piece of paper, a single sheet signed by 5 of the 9 military officers who had judged her. 5 of the 9 men who convicted Mary Surratt had asked the president, in writing, to let her live. Years later, Andrew Johnson would swear that he never saw that sheet of paper. The man who carried the file to his desk would insist, for decades after, that he did. One of them was lying, and the lie has never been settled. 3 things are waiting inside this story. The first is that sheet of paper with 5 signatures. It either reached a president's eyes or it was hidden from them, and either answer is a scandal. The second is a uniform of the Pope's own guard, stripped off a young American arrested in Egypt 16 months after this hanging. A young man who many people, then and now, believed should have stood in that prison yard in her place. He was her son. The third is a second courtroom, 2 years after the first. Same family, same conspiracy, much of the same evidence, delivered by the very same witnesses. That trial ended with the defendant walking out into the sunlight a free man, and by then his mother had been in the ground for 2 years. School children still sing a rhyme about Lizzie Borden, who walked free. Nobody sings anything about Mary Surratt. There is only one photograph, taken a few minutes after the drop fell, of 4 bodies hanging from a single beam. On the left side of the frame, small and unmistakable in the summer glare, is the figure in black. She was the first woman the United States government ever executed. From the night of her arrest to the moment the floor opened under her, the whole process took 81 days. This is the record of how that was done, what the men who did it said in public, what they asked for in private, and what a jury decided 2 years later when it was offered the same story about a different Surratt. Subscribe if you want the case's history tried to bury. The story starts with a debt, not a grand one, a grubby, ordinary, humiliating one. In the fall of 1862, Mary Surratt was a widow in southern Maryland with 3 children, a farm, a tavern, and a dead husband whose papers turned out to be a map of everything he had never paid for. John Surratt Sr. died suddenly at the end of August that year, most likely of a stroke, at a crossroads that carried the family name, Surrattsville, a post office, a tavern, a polling place, and not much else, about 13 miles southeast of Washington. People in the neighborhood would remember him as a man who drank hard and borrowed harder. The tavern license, the farmland, the house in Washington he had once traded for, all of it came wrapped in notes and mortgages and small angry claims from neighbors. When he died, the debts did not die with him. They transferred, by law and by custom, onto the woman who had spent 22 years married to him. Before we go any further, one instruction, because it changes how you should listen to everything that comes next. Every ordinary fact you are about to hear, The marriage, the children, the church she joined, the debts she inherited, the rooms she rented, is going to be read back to her one day by 9 men in uniform deciding whether she should hang. So do not hear it as a life. Hear it the way they will, as evidence. The question that panel is going to ask is simple, and it is coming for her the whole time. When did an unlucky widow become a conspirator? Watch for the line, because even now, with everything on the table, honest people cannot agree on where it is. She had not chosen much of that life. Mary Elizabeth Jenkins was born around 1823 in Prince George's County, Maryland, into a family of tobacco farmers. Her father died when she was a toddler. Her mother, unusually for the time, kept the land, kept the accounts, and paid for her daughter to be educated at a female seminary across the river in Alexandria. 4 years of schooling, which was 4 years more than most Maryland farm girls ever saw. At that school, something happened that shaped every day of the rest of her life. The school was Catholic, and Mary converted. In the anti-Catholic Maryland of the 1830s, this was not a small thing. It cost her socially, and she did it anyway, and she stayed devout until the morning she died, with a priest's crucifix in front of her face. At around 17, she married John Harrison Surratt, a young man 10 years older, with land, ambition, and a temper that soured into alcohol. The marriage produced 3 children in 5 years: Isaac, the eldest, Anna, the only daughter, and John Jr., the baby of the family, born in 1844. The marriage also produced fires, lawsuits, mortgages, and the slow grinding shame of a household that looked respectable from the road and was drowning in its ledgers. And it is worth saying plainly what kind of household it was. The Surratts were slaveholders. Enslaved people worked the tobacco fields and the tavern kitchen, and when the war came and Maryland's enslaved workers began freeing themselves by walking away, Mary Surratt counted their absence as a financial injury. Her sympathies in the war that was coming were never in doubt. Not to her neighbors, not to her church, and not, eventually, to the United States government. By 1852, her husband had built the tavern at the crossroads, and the crossroads took the family's name, Surrattsville. The tavern was a public house, a polling place, and the local post office, and John Sr. became postmaster. On paper, the Surratts were the little aristocracy of their crossroads. In the account books, they were one bad harvest from losing all of it. Then, at the end of August 1862, John Sr. collapsed and died. And here is where the arithmetic of this story begins. Because everything Mary Surratt did for the next 3 years, every decision that would later be read aloud in a military courtroom as evidence of treason, began as a decision about money. She was left with roughly 200 acres of struggling land, a tavern she could not run alone, and a stack of her husband's debts. One of those debts runs through this entire story like a red thread, so hold on to it. A neighbor named John Nothey owed the family $479 for a piece of land he had bought 13 years earlier. He had simply never paid. A widow with creditors at her door spent years trying to collect $479 from a man who did not feel like paying a woman. Remember that number, $479. On the last free day of her life, that number is the reason she gives for climbing into a buggy. Her sons were no help. Isaac had already gone south to Texas and put on a Confederate uniform. He would not see his mother again. That left 17-year-old John Jr., pulled out of his Catholic seminary studies, suddenly the man of a failing house. In September 1862, 10 days after his father's funeral, The government made John Jr. postmaster of Surrattsville in his father's place. It is almost funny, in the coldest possible way. The United States government handed the Surrattsville post office to a teenager whose family sympathies ran south, in a county where the mail was already the least of what moved through a crossroads tavern at night. Because that is the other thing about Surrattsville, the thing the neighbors knew and the government only half knew. Southern Maryland was Confederate country without the flag, tobacco country, slave country, church country, and every road in it ran down toward the Potomac crossings into Virginia. Along those roads ran what the Confederates called the secret line, a relay of farmhouses and taverns that passed letters, newspapers, money, quinine, and human beings from Richmond to the north and back, past the Union pickets, night after night, for 4 years. The Surratt Tavern was a station on that line. Confederate couriers watered their horses there. Packages rested under its floorboards. And in 1863, the teenage postmaster of Surrattsville stopped being a postmaster because the federal authorities decided the Surratt boy was disloyal and gave the office to someone else. They were right. John Jr. was disloyal. By his own later account, delivered from a lecture stage with something close to pride, he spent the last 2 years of the war as a Confederate courier, riding between Richmond and Washington and Montreal, with dispatches sewn into his clothes, past Union cavalry, under false names. He was 20 years old, slight, clever, unbothered by risk, and very good at it. This is the piece of the story that gets lost when people picture Mary Surratt as an innocent widow who simply rented rooms to the wrong men. Her own son was a professional Confederate secret agent, not a soldier in a uniform on a battlefield, a courier in the Shadow War, trusted with dispatches by Richmond's spy service, moving between the Confederate capital and the Confederate agents based across the border in Montreal. He carried messages. He carried money. He learned the crossings of the Potomac the way other young men learned the streets of their town. And he did it out of a household his mother ran, using a tavern his family owned as one of the stations on the line. How much of that did she know? Her defenders would say a mother cannot be hanged for a son's secrets. Her prosecutors would say, no woman that pious, that careful, that much in command of her own house, watched her boy vanish for weeks and return with unexplained money and asked herself nothing. That argument, about how much a mother is presumed to know, is going to be standing in the room the day 9 officers decide whether she lives. It is standing in the room right now, in the winter of 1864, while the household still thinks the worst thing it has to fear is the debt collector. So picture the household at the end of 1864, a widow squeezed between creditors, running a tavern she cannot hold, in a county where the war is quietly lost, and everyone knows it. A daughter, Anna, 21 years old, unmarried, sharp-tongued, devoted to her mother, and a son who disappears for weeks at a time and comes back with money he does not explain. That fall, Mary Surratt made the move that killed her. It looked like the opposite. It looked like the first sensible financial decision anyone in that family had made in a decade. 10 years earlier, her husband had taken a narrow brick townhouse in Washington as part of a land trade, number 541 H Street, a few blocks from the center of the city. Mary decided to stop drowning at the crossroads. She would lease the tavern out, move to the city, and turn the H Street house into a respectable boarding house. Rented rooms, cooked meals, a widow's business, one of the only businesses a woman of her class could run without scandal. Understand the city she was moving into, because it matters. Washington, in the winter of 1864, was not the marble capital we picture now. It was a swollen, filthy, frightened army town. The war had roughly tripled its population in 3 years. The streets were mud in the wet and choking dust in the dry, and the half-finished dome of the Capitol sat over the whole mess like a promise nobody was sure would be kept. Soldiers were everywhere. Hospitals had taken over churches and hotels and the patent office. Prostitutes worked a district the soldiers themselves nicknamed after a general. Deserters, spies, contractors, and refugees moved through a place that had become, by geography, a Union fortress pressed right up against Confederate Maryland and Confederate Virginia, and it was a divided city inside its own walls. Washington sat below the old line that separated free states from slave states. Thousands of its residents had Southern blood, Southern cousins, and Southern sympathies they kept behind their teeth. A respectable boarding house run by a devout Maryland widow was exactly the kind of place where those sympathies could sit down to dinner and feel at home. That was good for business. It would also, in the end, be read aloud as evidence. The house itself still stands, and you can go and look at it. A narrow, 3-story brick townhouse, tall and thin, with a shop level below the street, and living floors stacked above. 10 rooms. A front parlor where callers were received. Bedrooms let out to lodgers upstairs. A kitchen and a dining room where the household gathered. It was 10 blocks from Ford's Theater. Everything that is about to happen happens inside a mile. On the 1st of December, 1864, she signed the tavern over to a former Washington policeman named John Lloyd for $500 a year. Hold on to him, too. John Lloyd, a heavy drinker with a policeman's memory for detail and a tenant's fear of his landlady. Within 8 months, this man's testimony would put a rope around her neck. By November, she was installed at H Street with Anna and a servant, hanging out the sign, taking in lodgers. 10 rooms, kept scrupulously clean. Grace said before meals, a portrait of her daughter's making on the mantel. Boarders came and went. A government clerk, a schoolgirl, a former schoolmate of John Jr.'s from the seminary, a soft, watchful young man named Louis Weichmann, who worked at the War Department, in the office that managed Confederate prisoners, and who liked to sit with the family in the evenings. Remember him as well. Of the 2 witnesses who would hang Mary Surratt, one was her tenant at the tavern, the other said grace at her dinner table. Weichmann is worth pausing on, because he is the closest thing this story has to a camera. He was 22, plump, soft-handed, and studying for the priesthood before the war pulled him into a clerk's job instead. He had known John Jr. at seminary years earlier, and when he came to Washington looking for cheap lodging, he found his old school friend's mother renting rooms. So he moved in. He slept in a room he shared with John Jr. himself. He ate at Mary's table every day for the better part of a year and a half. He went to Mass with the family. He called Mary, in his own later words, a mother to him. Whatever he saw in that house, he saw it from the inside, at close range, for 17 months. Hold that intimacy in mind. It is the reason his testimony would land like a blade instead of a rumor. The rest of the household was ordinary, in the way boarding houses are. A young woman named Honora Fitzpatrick, boarding while she went about the city. A little girl, the daughter of a Confederate surgeon, left in Mary's care and schooling. Anna, sharp and devoted, running the practical side of the house with her mother. A free black servant named Susan Mahoney, doing the heavy kitchen work. Lodgers came for a few weeks and left. Grace was said. Rooms were swept. The rent, mostly, was paid. And moving through this ordinary house, in the evenings, came men who were not ordinary at all. That is the whole engine of the tragedy, and it was already turning before anyone in the parlor understood it. A respectable widow's dining room, in a divided city, 10 blocks from the theater, was about to become the most closely watched address in the United States. A boarding house, a widow, a debt of $479, and a son who rode south in the dark. That is the whole inventory. Nothing in that inventory looks like history. It looks like 1,000 other households scraping through the last winter of the war. What broke this ordinary household wide open arrived on the 23rd of December, 1864, with its hat in its hand and the most famous face in America. On that day, 2 days before Christmas, John Jr. ran into an acquaintance on 7th Street, a country doctor from down home in Charles County, in the city on business. The doctor was walking with a companion he wanted to introduce. The doctor's name was Samuel Mudd. His companion was John Wilkes Booth. It is genuinely hard, from this distance, to feel what that name meant in December 1864. Booth was not a fringe figure. He was one of the most famous actors in the United States, 26 years old, beautiful by every account, from the most celebrated theatrical family in the country. He earned as much as $20,000 a season at a time when a clerk like Louis Weichmann earned about $80 a month. Women waited at stage doors for him. Hotels upgraded him. Strangers bought him drinks. And this man, this celebrity, took a sudden intense interest in a 20-year-old Confederate courier from a Maryland crossroads. Booth invited John Jr. and Weichmann back to his rooms at the National Hotel. There was wine. There was talk of land in Lower Maryland, which was the polite fiction. And then there were private words between Booth and John Jr. in the hallway, out of Weichmann's hearing, that were not about land. Because Booth was recruiting. The scheme, in that winter version, was not murder. It needs to be said clearly, because everything that follows turns on it. The plan Booth was building through the winter of 1864 and 5 was a kidnapping. Seize Abraham Lincoln, bundle him south along the secret line into Virginia, and ransom him for tens of thousands of Confederate prisoners of war. It was theatrical, desperate, and militarily fantastic, which is to say, it was exactly the plan an actor would write. For that plan, Booth needed what any smuggler needs: a route, safe houses, and men who knew the dark roads of southern Maryland. John Surratt Jr. was one of the best dark road men in the state. Within weeks, he was Booth's lieutenant, and Booth had become a caller at a certain boarding house on H Street. And here is why this particular family, and no other, got pulled to the center of the crime. The Surratts came with the infrastructure already built. The H Street boarding house sat in the middle of Washington, a respectable address where a famous actor could call on a widow without raising an eyebrow, a place to meet, to plan, to gather men. And 13 miles south sat the tavern at Surrattsville, sitting directly on the escape route into Confederate Virginia, a place already used to hiding things and asking no questions, run now by a tenant who could be leaned on, a meeting house at one end and a weapons cache on the getaway road at the other, joined by a son who knew every crossing of the river. Booth did not stumble onto the Surratts. He found in them, ready-made, the exact geography a plot to seize the president and run him south would need. That is the terrible luck of it. The family's ordinary assets, a boarding house and a country tavern, were also, to the right criminal eye, a perfect machine. Here the record needs handling with clean hands, because this is the exact place where Mary Surratt's life splits into two irreconcilable stories. What nobody disputes is this: Booth came to the H Street house, repeatedly, through the winter and spring. He sat in Mary Surratt's parlor. He was charming to Anna and the other young women, who clipped his photograph and kept it, the way young women kept photographs of actors. And more than once, when he called, he asked for private words with the widow herself, and got them, upstairs or by the parlor door. What was said in those private words is the whole at the center of this case. No one ever produced a witness to them. Everything else, everything, is inference stacked on inference. Around Booth, that winter, other men drifted through the house. A hulking, quiet young Confederate veteran who gave his name sometimes as Wood and sometimes as Payne, and whose real name was Lewis Powell. He stayed at the boarding house at least twice, once claiming to be a Baptist preacher. Anna and the young women privately laughed at him. A German-born carriage repairman from Port Tobacco named George Surratt, shabby and nervous, who drank too much and talked too much, and was tolerated because he knew the river crossings. Mary put him out of the house after liquor was found in his room, which tells you something about her rules. He kept coming back to visit anyway. And a Washington pharmacy clerk named David Harold, young, eager, and dim, who knew the lower Maryland roads from years of bird hunting. A military prosecutor would later stand in front of 9 officers and describe that parlor as the nest in which the egg of the assassination was hatched. That sentence convicted her as much as any testimony did. So test it honestly. Did Confederate agents and future assassins meet under Mary Surratt's roof, eat at her table, and consult with her son? Yes, beyond argument. Did the widow who ran the house know what her son and the famous actor were building? She swore she did not. She was a landlady, her defenders said, in a city of landladies, and her parlor was full because her rooms were cheap and her cooking was good. The government said no 42-year-old woman who ran that tight a household, who said grace over that table and locked those doors at night, could be blind to a conspiracy assembling in her own front room. That question, blindness or complicity, is the entire case. Keep it in front of you as the events accelerate, because in 81 days, a panel of officers is going to answer it with a rope, and they are going to answer it without a single witness to anything she said to John Wilkes Booth. Look closely at the shape of that winter, because it is genuinely strange. Booth was rich, and he spent it. He was buying carbines, revolvers, horses, a boat to cross the river, and the loyalty of small, broke, disappointed men. Surratt had a rowboat and knew the water. Harold had the roads. Powell had the nerve and the muscle. John Surratt had the secret line and the trust of Richmond. Booth had the fame and the cash and the plan. And the one place all of these men could be found, at one time or another, sitting down together as if it were the most natural thing in the world, was a certain widow's parlor on H Street. Other traffic moved through that parlor too. A young woman the boarders remembered as a veiled lady. A Confederate courier who used the name Slater passed through the house and rode south with John Jr. more than once, carrying dispatches. Money changed hands that nobody could quite explain. John Jr. flashed cash he had not earned honestly. Booth came and went at hours that had nothing to do with renting a room. To a War Department clerk sitting at the dinner table taking it all in, and later to a prosecutor building a case. None of this looked like coincidence. It looked like a headquarters. And still there is no witness to a single guilty word from Mary. That is the maddening center of it. The traffic is real. The men are real. The money is real. The one thing missing, then and now, is proof of what the woman at the head of the table actually knew. The kidnapping plot came to a head in the middle of March, and it failed like a farce. On the 17th of March, 1865, Booth got word that Lincoln would attend a soldier's benefit at Campbell Hospital, on the 7th Street Road at the edge of the city. This was the chance. 6 or 7 armed men, a lonely stretch of road, a carriage. The band assembled, mounted, and rode out. John Surratt Jr. rode with them, armed. He never denied it. Years later, on a lecture stage, he described the ambush with the fondness other men reserve for college sports. Lincoln did not come. The president had changed his plans and was, with a symmetry that still reads like fiction, speaking at a hotel ceremony where the captured battle flag of a Confederate regiment was being presented. The would-be kidnappers milled on the road, lost their nerve, and scattered back into the city. 2 weeks later, Richmond fell. A week after that, Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The Confederacy the plot was meant to rescue stopped existing, and every practical justification for kidnapping Abraham Lincoln died with it. The kidnappers reacted the way sensible conspirators would. They quit. Surratt drifted. Powell was sent to Baltimore to wait, and John Surratt Jr. went back to the courier work that had never stopped, carrying Confederate dispatches north to Montreal. He left Washington at the start of April. On the night everything happened, he was more than 400 miles away in Elmira, New York, scouting a Union prison camp for a Confederate general, which is its own kind of alibi and its own kind of confession. Booth did not quit. Booth curdled. Somewhere in those first 2 weeks of April, as Washington lit itself with victory candles, the actor rewrote his failed adventure story into a revenge tragedy. On the 11th of April, standing on the White House lawn, he heard Lincoln give a speech proposing votes for black men. Witnesses put Booth in the crowd, telling a companion, "That is the last speech he will ever make." Now watch the calendar of Mary Surratt's last 3 days of ordinary life, hour by hour, because the entire legal case against her leaves inside 2 buggy rides. Tuesday, the 11th of April. Mary needs to go down to Surrattsville about money. The Nothey debt, the $479, because her own creditor is now pressing her in writing. She has no carriage, so Weichmann, the boarder, borrows one and drives her the 13 miles. On the road near Uniontown, they pass a buggy going the other way carrying John Lloyd, her tenant at the tavern. The 2 vehicles stop. Landlady and tenant lean toward each other and speak quietly. What was said in that quiet roadside exchange became, at trial, a matter of life and death. Lloyd would swear that Mary Surratt asked him about the shooting irons. 2 Spencer carbines, hidden weeks earlier between the joists above the tavern kitchen by her son, Harold, and Surratt, back in the kidnapping days. Lloyd would swear she told him they would be wanted soon. Lloyd's memory of that Tuesday had a problem, and her lawyers never fully dragged it into the light. By his own admission, he had been drinking. The conversation happened through carriage curtains, in passing, in a lane. And the man remembering it would spend that summer bargaining for his own neck. Friday, the 14th of April. Good Friday. In the morning, a letter arrives at H Street from her creditor about the Nothey land money, pressing her again. She resolves to go back down to Surrattsville that afternoon. Weichmann is sent to hire a buggy. As he leaves, he runs into Booth at the front door, and Booth, hearing the errand, presses $10 into the clerk's hand for the rental. Remember who paid for the ride. Before the buggy leaves, Booth calls at the house. He speaks with Mary privately, briefly, and when the widow climbs up beside Weichmann, she is carrying two things: the letters about her debt and a small package wrapped in brown paper, tied with string, about the size of a saucer stacked 3 high. Booth's package. She has agreed to drop it at the tavern. Inside the package, though there is no evidence she ever opened it, were Booth's field glasses. At the tavern that evening she meets Lloyd, who has spent the day at a court proceeding in a neighboring village and has been drinking steadily since morning. Multiple witnesses at the trial, including the man who rode with him, described him that day with the same word: drunk. Very drunk, one said. What happened in the few minutes at the tavern is, again, 2 stories. Lloyd's story, told under oath with prosecutors holding his life in their hands, is that Mary Surratt handed him the package and told him to have the shooting irons ready that night, along with 2 bottles of whiskey, because parties would call for them. Her story is that she went about her debt papers, handed over a package she had been asked to carry as a favor, dealt with a drunk tenant, fixed a broken spring on the buggy wheel, and drove home in the dark. There is no third witness to the words. There never was. The rope rests on the memory of a frightened alcoholic, recalling the busiest, drunkest day of his year. She got back to H Street around 8:30 that evening. Booth called at the house one last time, near 9 o'clock, and again the two spoke alone, for a few minutes. Then he rode down to the theater district. At about 10:15 that night, John Wilkes Booth walked into the state box at Ford's Theater and shot Abraham Lincoln through the back of the head. At the same hour, across the city, Lewis Powell forced his way into the home of the Secretary of State and stabbed his way toward the sickbed, wounding William Seward and cutting down others in the household before fleeing into the dark. This is the part that turns a murder into something the government would treat as an act of war. So understand its shape. It was not one killer. It was a coordinated strike. 3 men, 1 hour, timed to behead the government of the United States in a single night. Booth for the president, Powell for the Secretary of State. A third man, George Surratt, assigned to kill the vice president, Andrew Johnson, at his hotel. Surratt lost his nerve, drank himself brave, and then drank himself useless, and never went up the stairs. And so Andrew Johnson lived to become the president who would sign Mary Surratt's death warrant. Only one of the 3 targets died, but the intent was plain, and it was that intent, a plot to destroy the leadership of the nation in wartime, that the government would later use to justify trying civilians as enemy combatants before a panel of soldiers. And a few minutes after midnight, 2 riders pulled up at a darkened tavern 13 miles south at Surrattsville. Booth, with a broken leg, stayed in the saddle. Harold hammered on the door until Lloyd came down. They took the whiskey. They took the field glasses from the brown paper package. They took one of the 2 carbines, Booth refusing the second because of his leg. And as they turned into the road south, Booth, who could not resist an audience even now, called back to the drunk man in the doorway words Lloyd would repeat in court, like a man handing over his own ransom. "I am pretty certain that we have assassinated the president." The line of that night ran straight through Mary Surratt's front door, and it had been drawn there, hours earlier, in a buggy her son's employer paid for. Whether the woman holding the reins knew what she was carrying, or was the last errand girl of men who found a respectable widow useful, is the question a military commission gave itself 7 weeks to answer. The knock on her door came at 2 o'clock in the morning. 2 o'clock in the morning, Saturday the 15th of April. Lincoln is still alive, dying slowly in a back bedroom across from the theater. City detectives hammer on the door of 541 H Street, hunting the one name every witness at Ford's had screamed, Booth, and hunting the local man everyone knew ran with him, John Surratt. The detectives searched the house and found no one but boarders. Mary answered their questions in her nightclothes, calm, correct. Her son, she said, had been gone for 2 weeks, off in Canada as far as she knew. The detectives noted that the widow did not seem surprised enough. Then they left. That was the first visit. For 2 days, the house on H Street sat inside the most frantic manhunt in American history and did nothing, did not run, did not burn a single paper. On Monday evening, that stillness ran out. At about 11 o'clock on the night of the 17th of April, Army officers surrounded the house with orders to arrest everyone inside. Mary, Anna, a cousin, a young boarder. The women were gathering their shawls in the parlor, the officers waiting, the house lit and silent, and then somebody knocked. Think about the timing of this, because her whole fate pivots on 3 minutes of catastrophic luck. Of all the minutes in that week, the knock came while the arrest was actually in progress, with federal officers standing in the hall. The soldiers opened the door on a tall young man in a gray coat, with a pickaxe over his shoulder, and a knitted cap made from a shirt sleeve pulled down on his head. His boots were caked. His manner was wrong. He said he was a laborer, hired by the lady of the house to dig a gutter in the morning. The officers brought him into the light of the parlor and asked the lady of the house, and Mary Surratt raised her right hand in front of witnesses whose memories would be sworn into the record, and said words to this effect, "Before God, sir, I do not know this man. I have never seen him before. I did not hire him to dig a gutter. The man with the pickaxe was Lewis Powell, the man who had carved his way through Secretary Seward's household 3 nights earlier, the man who had slept in her boarding house that winter, twice, once for days at a stretch. He had sat at her dinner table. Her daughter had joked about him. Of all the doors in Washington, the most wanted knife man in America had walked, at the worst conceivable minute, to hers. Her defenders would spend the trial, and historians would spend a century explaining that moment. It was near midnight. The hallway gaslight was dim. He was in workman's filth, disguised, half-starved after 3 nights hiding in a cemetery. And Mary Surratt's eyesight was failing, a specific, documented failing that multiple witnesses would swear to. She could not recognize familiar faces across a street in daylight. Her own priest said it. Neighbors said it. The prosecution needed no century. She lied, they said. She knew him instantly, understood everything, and did what conspirators do at the door of a trap. She denied. Blindness or complicity. The whole case, standing in one gaslit hallway, holding a pickaxe. Before the women were let out, Mary asked the officers for a minute. She knelt in her own parlor and prayed. Then she climbed into the carriage. She would never stand in a room of her own again. She had 81 days to live. What the searchers took from the house that night, and in the days after, mattered less for what it proved than for how it would sound. A photograph of John Wilkes Booth, hidden behind a framed print on the mantel. It was Anna's, a girl's souvenir of a famous actor, tucked out of sight because her mother disliked the association. Cartes de visite of Confederate generals, a pistol, a mold for bullets, the ordinary sediment of a Maryland secessionist household, read aloud in a courtroom over the corpse of a president. They took Mary first to the old Capitol prison, then, at the end of April, to the Washington Arsenal, the fortress penitentiary on the river point south of the city. The men of the conspiracy were there too, brought in from the ironclad ships where they had been held. The men were kept with canvas hoods laced over their heads, padded, with slits only at the mouth, day and night, on the Secretary of War's orders. Chained wrists, chained ankles, a mattress and a bucket. Mary Surratt was spared the hood and the irons. She got a cell, a Bible, and a guard who was forbidden to speak to her. She was already sick. Prison food and a prison bucket, at 42, in a Washington summer, would grind her down week by week until the officers of the court began to notice her fading in front of them. Hold the geography of the arsenal in your mind, because it is one of the coldest facts in the whole record. From the end of April to the 7th of July, Mary Surratt was held inside a single fortress on a spit of land in the river, and inside that same fortress, on the 3rd floor, was the room where she would be tried. And in the yard of that same fortress was the ground where she would be hanged and buried. She was arrested, imprisoned, judged, executed, and buried without ever once leaving the walls. The building was a closed circle. She entered it a prisoner, and the only way the government ever intended her to leave it was in a pine box. Everything that looked like process, the 7 weeks of testimony, the lawyers, the witnesses, happened inside the machine that already held her body and had already dug her grave a few yards from her cell. Now stop, because before a single witness is sworn, the government makes the decision that historians have argued about for 160 years. The decision that, more than any testimony, decided who would live. Where do you try them? Lincoln died on the 15th of April. The courts of Washington were open that morning. Grand juries were sitting. The Constitution, on its face, promises a civilian jury to civilians accused of crime. 8 of the accused, including a boarding house widow who had never worn a uniform, were civilians. Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, wanted no jury. A jury meant 12 Washington residents, in a southern-leaning city, any one of whom could hang the case with a single vote. A jury meant rules of evidence, appeals, months. Stanton wanted a military commission, 9 officers, chosen by the War Department, a simple majority to convict, 2/3 to sentence a prisoner to death, no appeal to any court on earth, only to the president. Understand who Stanton was in that moment, because the whole machine ran on his will. He was the most powerful man in the government after the president, the Iron Secretary who had run the Union war effort, and he had stood at Lincoln's deathbed the morning the president died. It was Stanton who reportedly said, as Lincoln stopped breathing, that now he belonged to the ages. And it was Stanton who, within hours, had decided the assassination was not a lone crime, but the last blow of the Confederacy, an act of war, to be answered by the war power, fast and hard. Everything that followed, the hoods, the fortress, the commission, the speed, flowed from that conviction in that one grieving, furious man. He did not want justice as a courtroom understands it. He wanted the war's final enemies destroyed before the peace could protect them. Mary Surratt was standing, whether she understood it or not, directly in the path of a Secretary of War who had just watched his president die and had decided that mercy was a luxury the country could not afford. The new Attorney General, James Speed, wrote an opinion blessing it. The assassination, he reasoned, was an act of war against the commander-in-chief in a fortified wartime capital, so the killers were enemy belligerents, triable by military law. Former Attorney General Edward Bates, Lincoln's own first law officer, wrote in his diary that the opinion was a shame and said publicly that if the commission was lawful, he had been wrong about the Constitution all his life. Inside Johnson's cabinet, the Navy Secretary and the Treasury Secretary quietly agreed with Bates. Stanton won. On the 1st of May, President Johnson signed the order. 9 officers in dress uniform would judge the civilians, in a converted room on the 3rd floor of the arsenal, with the prosecutors also serving, in effect, as the court's own legal advisors. One of the 9 was a 38-year-old general named Lew Wallace, who passed the dull stretches of testimony, sketching the prisoners from the bench. 15 years later, he would write Ben-Hur, "Understand what the choice of that room meant for Mary Surratt in practical terms. In a civilian court, the statements Lloyd and Weichmann made under threat would have been tested by rules of evidence refined for exactly that danger. In a civilian court, a single doubting juror out of 12 would have saved her life. In the arsenal room, a death sentence needed only 2/3, 6 of the 9. So to live, she had to win over 4 officers out of 9, officers picked by the same department that was prosecuting her, in the same building where she slept in a cell. Hold that arithmetic. In a courthouse, 1 juror of 12 could have stopped it. In the arsenal, she needed 4 of 9, and the 9 had been chosen by the men who wanted her dead. And one more thing about that room, the thing modern readers find hardest to believe. Under the law of 1865, in military and civilian courts alike, the accused could not testify, not permitted. Mary Surratt sat through 7 weeks of a trial for her life, veiled, silent, fanning herself in the heat, forbidden by the law itself from ever telling the 9 men her own story under oath. Every other voice in America could speak about her. Hers is the one voice missing from the record, by design. The trial opened in the 2nd week of May, 1865. 8 defendants in a row on a raised platform. Powell the knife man, Harold the guide, Surratt, who had been assigned to kill the vice president and had gotten drunk instead, Dr. Mudd, who had set Booth's broken leg, Spangler the stagehand, Arnold and O'Laughlin the lapsed kidnappers, and at the end, apart from the men, in black, a chair of her own beside her lawyers, the widow. Her lawyers are their own small tragedy. When the trial began, she had no counsel at all, and a woman forbidden to testify needed a strong voice more than anyone in the room. A famous one stepped up, Reverdy Johnson, a United States Senator from Maryland, a former Attorney General of the United States, one of the most respected constitutional lawyers alive, agreed to defend her. For a moment, she had a giant in her corner. The commission broke him on the first day. Before he could argue anything, one of the officers challenged Johnson's very right to appear, questioning his loyalty because of a stance he had taken on a Maryland voter oath. The accusation was thin, and it was withdrawn, but the message had been delivered. Johnson, insulted and reading the room, mounted one great argument, that a military commission had no lawful power to try civilians while the real court stood open. Then he largely withdrew, leaving the daily fight to 2 young, able, badly outmatched junior lawyers named Frederick Aiken and John Clampett. The commission, which was the judge of its own authority, rejected the argument that it had no authority. Of course it did. Her strongest defender appeared only twice more. So the woman who could not speak for herself was defended, day to day, by 2 young men in their first great case, in front of 9 officers who had already ruled that the objection to their own power did not count. Before a single witness was sworn, the defense had lost the one fight that could have saved her, the fight over which room she was standing in. The newspapers had already tried her. Correspondents fought for seats to look at the she-devil of H Street, and complained they could see nothing but a veil. Understand the temperature of the country these 9 officers were judging inside. Lincoln was the first American president ever murdered, killed on Good Friday, 5 days after the war effectively ended, at the exact moment the nation had let itself begin to breathe. The grief curdled into something close to hysteria. The War Department flooded the region with cavalry and detectives and put staggering rewards on the conspirators, tens of thousands of dollars a head. Hundreds of people were arrested on suspicion, held without charge, questioned hard. Editorials demanded blood. Crowds nearly lynched men who spoke a careless word about the dead president. This was not a calm country weighing evidence. This was a wounded animal, looking for someone to punish, and the machinery of the state was moving as fast as it could to hand it someone. Booth was already dead, shot in a burning tobacco barn in Virginia on the 26th of April, 12 days into the greatest manhunt the country had ever mounted, which left the government story with a hole where its star belonged, and left 8 secondary characters to absorb a nation's scream for punishment. The man everyone wanted to see hang was in a grave. The people in the dock were what remained. And a country that had been promised vengeance was not going to accept that its chance for it had died in a Virginia barn. The War Department's file even had a name for the case that told the country the ending in advance: the trial of the assassins. For Mary Surratt, the government called 2 voices that mattered. Everything else was scenery, her tenant and her boarder. And before either man said a word, both of them had spent weeks learning exactly what happens to people the War Department is not finished with. Take John Lloyd first, because his 3 days on the stand are the spine of the death sentence. When the cavalry swept southern Maryland in the week after the assassination, they took the tavern keeper of Surrattsville with them. Lloyd was not treated as a witness. He was treated as an accomplice, which, on the plain facts, he was. The carbines had hung hidden above his kitchen for a month. The whiskey and the field glasses had passed through his hands at midnight to the most wanted man on the continent, and he had kept his mouth shut about all of it for days, while soldiers asked him direct questions. For nearly 2 weeks, Lloyd denied everything. Then the interrogators went to work on the simplest lever a man has. Detectives told him, in substance, that he was in the shadow of the rope himself, and that his memory was the only thing that could move him out of it. An officer who handled him testified that Lloyd broke down weeping, and that when he broke, the first thing that poured out of him was blame. That woman, he sobbed, had ruined him. By the time he reached the witness chair in May, John Lloyd was a man testifying with his own noose lying in his lap. He gave the commission the 2 roadside sentences: the shooting irons question on the 11th, the shooting irons instruction, with the package and the whiskey, on the 14th. Have them ready. Parties will call for them tonight. Nobody else on earth heard either sentence. Mrs. Offutt, his own sister-in-law, present at the tavern on the 14th, heard the package mentioned and heard nothing about weapons. The defense hammered at what Lloyd was on that Good Friday, by his own neighbor's account, a man soaked since morning, and at what he was by April's end, a prisoner bargaining with the government that would decide whether he lived. The commission heard all of that. The commission also heard him say the sentences, plainly, twice, under a prosecutor's steady hand. Write down what convicts her, because it is genuinely this short. 2 remembered sentences, from 1 compromised man. Weigh what that testimony is actually made of, the way a careful juror would. There is no letter. There is no second witness to the words. There is no confession. There is a single man who hid the weapons himself, who lied to investigators for nearly 2 weeks, who was drinking on both of the days in question. And he did not produce the deadly sentence about shooting irons until he understood, with total clarity, that the government could hang him instead of her. Take his own noose out of the room, and you have taken away the only reason he had to remember it that way. Leave his noose in the room, and every word he says is bought. That is not a small crack in the case. That is the case, standing on one leg, on the memory of a terrified drunk who had every reason on earth to give the government the sentence it needed. And yet, the sentence, if he said it truly, is damning. Have those shooting irons ready. Parties will call for them tonight. Field glasses in her lap, put there by Booth. Whiskey to be readied. Weapons her own son had hidden. If Mary Surratt truly spoke those words on that road, she was not a blind widow running an errand about a debt. She was a courier for murder. Everything, the whole distance between a rope and a long life, rides on whether a frightened alcoholic remembered a single sentence correctly or remembered it the way the men holding his life wanted it remembered. The commission chose to believe him. A civilian jury, 2 years later, hearing the same man, would not. Then the government called the border, and the border was worse, because the border was believable. Louis Weichmann came to the stand, scrubbed and careful, a 22-year-old War Department clerk with a seminarian's soft manners. He had lived at H Street for 17 months. He had eaten at her table, prayed in her parlor, called her, in his own word, a mother. If Lloyd sounded like a man saving his neck, Weichmann sounded like a heartbroken son doing his duty, and that is exactly why his testimony cut deeper. He gave the commission the whole population of the house, Booth's repeated calls, the private conversations between the actor and the widow, upstairs, in the parlor, by the door, Powell under his false names, the Baptist preacher who slept there and sat at dinner, Surratt tolerated, expelled, returning, John Jr. flashing money, riding south, whispering with Booth for hours. The day of the failed kidnapping, when John burst in wild with a pistol in his hand, and Powell behind him, and Booth behind them both, and the three retreated upstairs together, and he gave them the buggy rides, Booth's $10 for the hire, the package on her lap. The private word between Booth and the widow at 9 o'clock, that Good Friday evening, 3 hours before Harold hammered on the tavern door. None of it, notice, is a confession. Weichmann never claimed she said one guilty word to him. What he built, brick by brick, was proximity, her roof, her table, her errands, her son. The prosecution's whole theory of Mary Surratt is Weichmann's house tour with a gallows attached. Now hold the boarder up to the same light as the tenant. Louis Weichmann worked in the office that managed Confederate prisoners of war, and by his own admissions had passed information about those prisoners to John Surratt, information that traveled south. He had lived for a year and a half in the middle of everything the government called a nest, and had noticed, by his account, everything, and reported none of it while it mattered. In the first days after the assassination, he was not a witness. He was a suspect, held, questioned, and made to understand precisely how a clerk becomes a defendant. A friend of his, John Brophy, would swear in a written statement that Weichmann admitted his testimony had been shaped under threat of prosecution and that his conscience was eating him. The commission refused to receive it, and in the days after the trial, that statement went, in person, all the way to the president's door. Hold that thought until the last morning. So there is the case. One drunk with a noose in his lap, remembering sentences no one else heard. One frightened clerk, testifying his way from the defendant's side of the room to the witness's side, and around them, the scenery, the photograph of Booth behind the print on her mantel, the pistol and the bullet mold, the Confederate cartes de visite, Powell with his pickaxe at her door. Before God, sir, I do not know this man. Against that, her young lawyers built the only defense available to a woman forbidden to speak. Other voices, witness after witness on her eyesight, that she could pass close acquaintances on the street at midday and not know them, that she needed others to read for her by lamplight, that her failing sight was old, documented, and worsening. Witness after witness on her character, priests who had known her 20 years, neighbors, tradesmen, who described a pious, charitable, unremarkable widow. The Nothi debt papers, laid out item by item, giving her Good Friday ride to Surrattsville, a reason that had nothing to do with carbines, a 13-year-old debt of $479, and the creditor's letter that arrived that very morning, pressing her, which the defense read into the record. The priests were the heart of it. Roman Catholic clergymen who had known Mary Surratt for years came into a military courtroom in an anti-Catholic era at real cost to themselves and swore to her piety and her charity. One had known her since she was a girl. They described a devout woman who went to Mass, who gave what little she had, who prayed over her table, and who was, in their long experience of her soul, no one's idea of a murderer. In a Protestant country still suspicious of their church, standing up in that room for the most hated woman in America took a kind of courage the prosecution never had to spend. And Anna testified. Her own daughter, 22 years old, took the stand and tried to save her mother's life with her voice. It was Anna, not a stranger, who had to stand in that room and account for the photograph of Booth found behind the print on the mantel. It was hers, she said. A girl's keepsake of a famous actor, kept out of sight because her mother disliked the man. The defense produced photographs of other actors and generals the girls had collected, to show that a picture of Booth in a house full of young women proved nothing but that young women collected pictures. Whether the 9 officers heard a daughter's truth or a daughter's desperation, no one can say. They heard it from a girl who would be at the foot of the president's staircase within weeks, begging. And one fact her lawyers returned to again and again, because it is the fact that fits worst with guilt. She stayed, for 3 days after the assassination, with the city screaming and her son's name in the papers. The alleged conspirator sat in her own parlor, burned nothing, ran nowhere, and answered the door. 7 weeks it went on, in a packed room over the arsenal, in wool uniforms in the Washington heat, more than 350 witnesses across the 8 defendants. Spectators came with passes, senators' wives among them, to stare at the veiled woman the papers had promised them. Reporters complained she gave them nothing. No tears for the sketch artists, no outbursts, just the slow motion of a palm leaf fan, hour after hour. Some days she was too sick to sit through the session, and the proceedings simply continued around her empty chair, because the calendar had a destination. Understand the physical fact of that courtroom, because it tells you what the trial already believed about its verdict. Every morning, the 7 male defendants were marched up from the cells in irons, their wrists cuffed, iron balls chained to their ankles. Over their heads, until the moment they entered the room, they wore the padded canvas hoods that the Secretary of War had ordered kept on day and night. Grown men, hooded like falcons, so that they could not see, could not speak to one another, could barely sleep. They were unhooded only to be judged, then hooded again, and taken back down. Mary Surratt sat at the end of that row of chained men, veiled by her own choice rather than the army's. The one prisoner spared the irons and the hood, which fooled no one about the direction the whole apparatus was pointed. The room was small and hot and jammed. The 9 officers sat at a long table. The prosecutors, who also served as the court's legal advisors, worked the witnesses. Artists sketched. Clerks scribbled. And the defendants sat and listened to a nation's grief being turned, witness by witness, into a rope. For most of them, the evidence was overwhelming, and the outcome was never in doubt. Powell had carved through the Secretary of State's household in front of witnesses. Surratt had confessed his assignment. Harold had been captured in the barn beside Booth's body. For those men, the trial was a formality with a scaffold at the end of it. Mary Surratt was different, and everyone in the room knew she was different, which is exactly why her 2 witnesses had to carry so much. There was no knife in her hand, no confession from her mouth, no capture at a crime scene. There was a house, a son, 2 buggy rides, and the memory of 2 frightened men. The government needed those 2 men to be believed the way it needed nothing else in the entire proceeding. Here is where an honest telling has to stop and turn around. Because if this were only a story about lying witnesses and a rigged room, it would be a simple story, and it is not simple. Set Lloyd aside entirely. Set Weichmann aside. Use only the facts nobody disputed, and look at her the way the 9 officers looked at her. Her house sheltered, fed, and hid every principle of the conspiracy, except Booth himself, and Booth was its most frequent caller. Her son was Booth's chief lieutenant, and she was closer to that son than to anyone alive. In the last 4 days before the murder, she made 2 trips to the exact tavern where the killer's weapons were cached, the second trip on the killer's money, carrying the killer's field glasses, hours before he collected them. The most violent member of the plot, on the run, chose her doorstep out of every doorstep in Washington, and she denied his face in front of officers with a confidence that read, "To every man in that hallway," as a lie. A modern historian who has studied her longer than anyone, and who is no apologist for the government's methods, concludes that Mary Surratt was probably not an innocent bystander, that she likely knew of the kidnapping scheme and helped keep her son's secrets. And it is fair to say many careful readers of the record land somewhere near there. Not the she-devil, not the blameless martyr, a Confederate mother in a Confederate parish, keeping a Confederate house, who saw what she chose to see. But notice what that honest, uncomfortable middle position actually amounts to. Knowledge of a kidnapping plot that was abandoned, loyalty to a guilty son, a house kept open to bad men. Under the law, even under the military commission's own rules, none of that is the crime she was hanged for. To hang her, the government needed her inside the murder, knowingly moving its tools on its last afternoon. And for that, everything, absolutely everything, ran through the memory of the drunk and the fear of the clerk. That is the file. That was always the file. The question was never really whether Mary Surratt was a good woman. The question was whether that file, those 2 men, those 2 remembered sentences, could carry the weight of the first female execution in the history of the Republic. That question never went away. It has been argued for 160 years, and it is being argued still. Within a generation of the hanging, a lawyer and historian published a study of the case with a title that pulled no punches, calling it a judicial murder. Others have defended the commission, arguing that a Confederate house that sheltered assassins earned its fate. Whole books line up on each side. What almost no serious student of the record defends anymore is the way it was done. The military room she should never have stood in. the two witnesses whose testimony would not survive a real cross-examination. The speed, the buried or ignored plea for mercy. You can believe Mary Surratt knew more than she ever admitted, and still believe that the process that killed her was a stain. Most of the people who have looked hardest at the file believe exactly that, both things at once, and the two beliefs do not cancel. They compound. On the 29th of June, the 9 officers locked the door to decide, with the president's signature, the only appeal left in the world. The 9 deliberated behind closed doors at the end of June, working through 8 prisoners one by one. No transcript of that room exists. What exists is the arithmetic they worked under. A simple majority, 5 votes, to convict. 2/3, 6 votes, to kill. All 8 defendants were found guilty in some degree. The stagehand got 6 years. Mudd and the 2 lapsed kidnappers got life. Mudd escaping the rope, by later accounts of the room, by a single vote. Powell, Harold, and Surratt were sentenced to hang. No surprises in any of it. Then the 9 came to the widow, and the room, for the first time, stalled. We know it stalled because of what the paperwork carried out of it. To sentence Mary Surratt to death, the commission needed 6 of 9 votes, and it got them. The sentence reads like all the others. Guilty. Hang her by the neck until dead. But stapled to that sentence, when the record left the room, was something that exists for no other defendant. Something with no legal standing at all. Something 5 soldiers invented because the machine they were operating had no other outlet for what they felt. A petition, addressed to the President of the United States, signed by 5 of the 9 officers who had just convicted her, including the Commission's own president, the senior general in the room. It asked, in consideration of her sex and her age, that Andrew Johnson commute the sentence of Mary Surratt from death to imprisonment for life. Sit with the strangeness of that sheet for a moment, because there is nothing else quite like it in American military justice. A majority of the court that sentenced a prisoner to die, telling the one man with the power of mercy, in writing, on the same day, in the same file, that they did not want her to die. Men who could simply have voted against death, and did not, or could not, and instead reached for a half measure that pushed the decision, and the guilt, 1 desk higher. 5 signatures. General Hunter, who presided, General Kautz, General Foster, General Ekin, Colonel Tompkins. Remember the number 5, because within a decade, powerful men will be swearing under oath about whether that sheet of paper was ever allowed to reach the one desk it was addressed to. The verdicts were sealed on the 30th of June and sent up the chain. And then, for 5 days, nothing. The prisoners were told nothing. The public was told nothing. The President of the United States was, at that exact moment, sick in his rooms, seeing almost no one. Watch what that silence was for, because it was not idleness. It was engineering. When the sentences finally became public, they came bundled with an execution order set for less than 2 days later. Count the time that design left for anyone to act. No time to organize public pressure. No time for a proper legal appeal to work its way up. No time for the country to absorb the shock that a woman was to hang and to push back before the trap fell. The 5 silent days and the 2-day execution window were not an accident of a busy government. They were the shape of a machine built to finish before anyone could stop it. The whole 81 days had been fast. The last week was the fastest of all, and it was fast on purpose. On the 5th of July, Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt, the Army's chief lawyer and the engine of the entire prosecution, carried the trial record to the White House, and sat with Johnson, alone, to review the sentences. No secretary, no witness, 2 men and a stack of paper on which 8 lives were riding, one of those lives a woman's. What happened in that meeting is the black box at the center of this story. Holt walked out with Johnson's signature approving every sentence and an execution order of brutal speed. The 4 condemned would hang in less than 48 hours on the 7th of July, between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. The question is what Johnson signed passed. The Clemency petition was physically part of the record Holt carried, sewn in with the findings. Johnson would later insist, for the rest of his life, that Holt never showed it to him, never mentioned it, that he approved a death sentence, in ignorance of the fact that most of the court that imposed it had begged him to soften it. Holt would insist, to his own dying day, that Johnson read it that afternoon and dismissed it. There is testimony that Johnson privately said the time had come to make an example, that no one around him is recorded urging delay, and that when pressed in later years he never once expressed regret. One of the 2 men who sat in that room lied about the sheet of paper until the day he died. The record cannot tell us which. What the record can tell us is what each man had to gain, and we will come back to that ledger at the end, when you have seen everything else. The condemned found out on the afternoon of the 6th of July, the day before. A general climbed the prison stairs and read each of them the finding. Death by hanging tomorrow. Mary Surratt had been sick for weeks. When the order was read to her, she collapsed, and the accounts from inside the prison describe something close to physical dissolution, weeping, prostration, a woman who had kept 7 weeks of courtroom composure coming apart in an afternoon. She had, roughly, 24 hours left, and Washington outside the walls was already loud with hammering. The scaffold was going up in the prison yard, big enough for 4, and the government, certain of its schedule, had the graves dug in advance, a few steps from the drop, with 4 pine boxes stacked beside them. And here is the thing that almost no one in Washington could make themselves believe. The United States was about to hang a woman. It had never done it before. In the whole history of the federal government, no woman had ever been executed, and a great many people, including people fully convinced Mary Surratt was guilty, simply could not accept that the army would go through with it against a middle-aged widow. The disbelief was everywhere. It was in the crowd. It was in the newspapers. It was in the prison itself, where the hangman would build her noose, expecting never to use it. The whole city held a quiet, stubborn faith that at the last moment, someone with the power to stop it would stop it. That faith is the reason the next 24 hours look the way they do. Everyone was waiting for a door to open. What happened in those 24 hours is a story about doors. Anna Surratt, 22 years old, went to the White House to beg for her mother's life. She got as far as the foot of the staircase. 2 powerful men had planted themselves there through those days, a senator from Kansas and a former senator from New York, the president's political gatekeepers, and they turned the girl away. She came back and was turned away again. Witnesses described her sitting on the White House steps in the July heat, crying, asking anyone going in to carry a word up to the man upstairs. A senator's widow, moved by the sight, swept past the guards and pleaded the case to Johnson's face. Nothing moved. Hold the image of those 2 men at the staircase. The senator from Kansas, James Lane. The former senator from New York, Preston King. Their part in this story is 30 seconds long. A hand raised at a stair. A girl refused. Remember them anyway. This story is not finished with either of them. Through the same doors that would not open for Anna went other traffic that final night. John Brophy's sworn statement about Weichmann, the one claiming the government's crucial witness had confessed his testimony was pressured, was carried toward the president. Priests pressed for even a few days' delay, and one of them would say for the rest of his life that he was made to understand his church's standing in Washington depended on his silence about her innocence. 5 days of official quiet had told everyone which way gravity ran, and in a cell in the arsenal, the man who had actually swung the knife on assassination night did something no one asked him to do. Lewis Powell, who had nothing left to trade and nothing left to fear, told the officers around him, in his last hours, that Mrs. Surratt was innocent, that she had known nothing of the murder. The hangman himself would remember Powell's words, and would say years later that he believed them. It is the only statement of its kind from inside the conspiracy, a dying man's unforced verdict on the woman convicted beside him, and it changed nothing. Her lawyers had one move left, and they made it in their nightclothes. At 2 a.m. on the 7th of July, Aiken and Clampett woke a civilian judge of the district's Supreme Court and asked for a writ of habeas corpus. It is the oldest order in the law, the one that drags a prisoner out of any jail in the land and puts her in front of a civilian bench to ask one question. By what right do you hold this person? The judge, Andrew Wiley, heard them out by lamplight and did something that took actual courage. He signed it. He ordered the army to produce Mary Surratt in his courtroom at 10 that morning. For about 7 hours, the machine paused. A civilian court had reached into the War Department's fortress and put its hand on the rope. At 10 o'clock, the courtroom waited. The prisoner did not come. Instead, close to noon, the commanding general of the district walked in with the Attorney General of the United States beside him and handed up a paper signed that morning by Andrew Johnson. The President of the United States hereby suspends the writ of habeas corpus in this case. The one door in America still open to her, closed by name, by the one man her judges had petitioned for mercy. Judge Wiley put on the record that his court was powerless against the army and adjourned. The general rode back to the arsenal to supervise the hanging he had just been ordered to complete. It was by then early afternoon, and close to 100 degrees in the prison yard. A crowd of perhaps 1,000, passes required, packed the walls and windows. Soldiers sat along the top of the wall with their legs dangling, like boys at a fair. Reporters had their seats. Officers had brought guests. It had the look of an event, a thing to be witnessed and told about later, and in a sense, that is exactly what it was. The first time the United States had ever gathered a crowd to watch it hang a woman. The 4 graves lay open in the corner, in plain view of the scaffold, the pine boxes beside them, and fresh dirt drying in the sun. Everything was ready. Everything had been ready for a day. The only thing the yard was still waiting for, right up to the last minutes, was the horseman who never came. The hangman was a captain named Christian Rath, and Rath had spent the previous night on a detail he did not believe in. 4 nooses. On the last one, the one for the woman, he tied 5 loops instead of the regulation 7, because, as he said afterward, he was certain it would never be used. The army would not hang a woman. Everyone in the yard believed some version of that sentence. General Hancock had stationed mounted couriers in relays along the road from the White House to the prison gate, so that a pardon could gallop the distance in minutes. All morning, men glanced at that gate. At 1 o'clock, the procession came out into the glare. She came first, in black, a veil over her face, a priest on either side, so weak that soldiers half carried her up the steps to the platform. They seated the 4 condemned in chairs on the platform, and it was here, over the woman in black, that a soldier raised the umbrella against the sun. They shaded her from the heat while they bound her. Strips of cloth around her arms, around her ankles, over her skirts, for modesty. The order and the findings were read aloud. The priests murmured. Powell, beside her, said his last words about the men who had put her there, that she did not deserve to die with them. When they moved her to the drop and pulled the bonnet from her head to fit the noose, she spoke to the officers steadying her, and the men closest to her wrote down the same small sentence. "Please, don't let me fall." Captain Rath clapped his hands 3 times. On the 3rd clap, the supports were knocked away, and the 4 fell together. That is as far as this account will follow it. What the crowd saw, the photographs, taken by Alexander Gardner from a window above the yard, still exist. They are the only photographs of a federal execution of a woman in the history of the United States. And they show, among other details, the umbrella, folded now, and the soldiers on the wall, no longer swinging their legs. 81 days from the knock on her door, 53 days of trial, 5 signatures asking for her life, 1 day's notice. It was the 7th of July, 1865, and the government of the United States had hanged a boarding house keeper on the remembered sentences of 2 terrified men. The crowd went home through the heat. The 4 bodies were put into the 4 pine boxes and buried beside the scaffold before supper. And 1,100 miles to the north, in a village in Quebec, a slight young man with a new haircut and a borrowed name read about it in a newspaper and stayed exactly where he was, her son. It is time to talk about her son. On the night Lincoln was shot, John Surratt Jr. was in Elmira, New York, 400 miles from Ford's Theater, on Confederate business, checking the defenses of a Union prison camp. That much even his enemies came to accept. He was a kidnapper in waiting, a courier, a plotter soaked to the elbows in the conspiracy's first version. He was not, on the night itself, one of the killers. He learned of the assassination on the 15th, in transit, when he saw his own name in a newspaper column of wanted men. And here is the decision that everything after flows from, the decision that separates him from every other person in this story. His mother was in Washington. Within days, the papers reached Canada, carrying word that the government had arrested her. He kept going north. Catholic priests hid him in Quebec, first in Montreal, then in a village rectory, through the entire spring and summer. He grew a beard, parted his hair on the other side, and waited. The United States government put $25,000 on his head. Through May, June, and the first days of July, from hiding, he followed his mother's trial in the newspapers, day by day, witness by witness. He would admit that himself, years later, from a stage. He read Lloyd's testimony. He read Weichmann's, his own school friend, and raged at it. He read, in the 2nd week of July, what the government of the United States had done in the arsenal yard to a 42-year-old widow in his family's name. And what he did about it was continue to be hidden. Sit with that, because it is the moral center of everything that comes after. The one person who could have walked into a Washington police station and said, "Take me, I am the man you actually want," was reading about his mother's trial in a newspaper and choosing his own skin. We cannot know for certain that his surrender would have saved her. The machine was moving fast, and it wanted a conviction. But there is a real argument, made by serious people then and since, that the government hanged the mother, in part because it could not lay hands on the son, that Mary Surratt died as a substitute for the man who got away. If there is any truth in that, then the thing that killed her was not only 2 remembered sentences, it was also a locked door in Quebec, and a young man standing behind it, deciding not to open it. He would live with that decision for 50 years, and by the evidence of how he lived with it comfortably. In September, with the manhunt cooling, his protectors moved him. A doctor dressed him, painted his face like a consumptive invalid, and put him on an ocean liner out of Quebec under a false name. He crossed to Liverpool, drifted through England and France, and by early 1866, the son of Mary Surratt did one of the strangest things any fugitive in American history has ever done. He went to Rome, and he enlisted, under the name John Watson, in the Papal Zouaves, the private army of the Pope. You can read that as piety, a hunted Catholic boy running to the arms of the church that had hidden him. You can read it as tradecraft, because the Papal States had no extradition treaty with the United States, which made the Pope's army possibly the safest uniform on earth for an American fugitive. Either way, the picture is real. While his mother's grave settled beside a scaffold in Washington, John Surratt drilled in the hills outside Rome in the gray and red of the Vatican's own guard, with a rifle on his shoulder and a saint's medal on his chest. And there is a bitter symmetry in it that should not go unspoken. Part of what had made Mary Surratt so easy to hate, part of the atmosphere that let a military commission hang her, was the old American suspicion of her church. She was a convert, devout, her house full of priests, in a country that half believed Catholic loyalty was a kind of treason all its own. That suspicion had helped bury the mother, and now the son, the actual conspirator, was being sheltered and clothed and armed by the very center of that church, safe under the Pope's own flag, precisely because it stood outside the reach of the United States. The faith that had been used as a weight to sink the mother became the wall that protected the son. The same church, 2 opposite fates, the difference being only which Surratt the government could reach. It did not last, and it ended the way these stories end. A face from home, another man in the Zouaves, a Canadian who had known him back in Maryland before the war, recognized Watson for Surratt. The man wrote to the American minister in Rome, partly, by his own account, from duty, and partly for the reward. The diplomats moved quietly. The Vatican, presented with the identification, did something that embarrassed Washington's assumptions. Without any treaty, without being formally asked, the papal government ordered Surratt arrested. On the 7th of November, 1866, Zouave guards took him into custody at Veroli, a hill town southeast of Rome, and locked him in the local barracks overnight for transfer to prison. At dawn, they marched him out past a low wall at the edge of a ravine, and John Surratt, who had spent 4 years outrunning Union cavalry on Maryland roads, wrenched free of his escort, jumped onto the parapet, and went over the edge. The guards who ran to the wall expected to look down at a body. The drop witnesses described was somewhere between 30 feet and 100, onto rock and brush. He survived it, hurt but moving, and by the time the garrison organized a pursuit, he was gone down the valley. What followed was a 3-week chase across a continent that reads like the adventure novel John Surratt apparently believed he was living in. He begged shelter from Garibaldi's rebels, the Pope's own enemies, who liked his nerve and passed him along. He crossed Italy to Naples, talked his way onto a steamer, and sailed for Egypt, still wearing his Zouave uniform because it was the only clothing he owned. American officials were cabling ahead of him the entire way. When the steamer reached Alexandria on the 23rd of November, United States officers were waiting on the dock. They arrested him in the Pope's uniform, under an American flag, on Egyptian ground, 16 months and 16 days after the trapdoor opened under his mother. Stand back and measure the effort. To catch John Surratt, the United States government had reached across an ocean. It had worked its diplomats in Rome and its consuls in Egypt, tracked a single fugitive through Italy and Naples and Alexandria, and finally laid hands on him on another continent, in the uniform of a foreign army. It spent months and a fortune and the attention of the State Department on one slight young Confederate courier. Now hold that beside the other number. His mother, the government caught by knocking on her own front door, and killed in 81 days. It took the United States a global manhunt to capture the guilty son. It took a knock on a door and 11 weeks to hang the mother in his place. The imbalance is the whole story, and the government was about to make it worse, because having crossed the world to catch him, it was now going to fail to convict him at all. A United States warship, the Swatara, carried him home in irons. It docked at Washington in February 1867, and the government that had hanged Mary Surratt in 81 days now had, at last, the Surratt it had actually been hunting all along. The courier, the recruiter, Booth's lieutenant, the man whose name had dragged his mother's house into the file. Now the government had to try him, and the calendar had quietly moved the ground under everything. 16 months earlier, the Supreme Court of the United States had finally answered the question that Mary Surratt's lawyers had asked in a converted room over the arsenal. In a case about an Indiana civilian tried by Army officers, the court ruled that military commissions may not try civilians anywhere the civilian courts are open, not in wartime fervor, not for the worst of crimes, not for anyone. The Constitution, the justices wrote, is not suspended by fear. Read what that ruling actually said, because it is Mary Surratt's whole defense, handed down by the highest court in the land, 1 year after she was dead. The justices wrote that the founders had foreseen exactly this danger, the danger that in a crisis, a government would reach for shortcuts and call them necessity. They wrote that the guarantee of a civilian trial was meant precisely for times of fear and upheaval, because those are the only times a government is ever tempted to take it away. A right that vanishes the moment it is needed is not a right at all. The very argument Reverdy Johnson made and the commission brushed aside, that open civilian courts left no room for military ones, was now the settled law of the United States. Every word of that ruling applied to the boarding house widow of 1865. It arrived 1 year too late to be of any use to her, but it meant that her son, arrested for the very same conspiracy, would get what she was denied: a civilian courtroom, a jury of 12, rules of evidence, the presumption of innocence, same family, same plot, same government, different room. Watch closely what the different room does. The trial of John Surratt opened in the district's criminal court in June 1867 and ran 2 months, longer than his mother's. The government wanted blood and brought its full weight, charging him with murder itself, arguing he had been in Washington that night, helping direct the crime, whatever Elmira said. Over 170 witnesses came through, and among them, walking back into the record like ghosts, came the same 2 men. John Lloyd, the tenant, told his tavern story again. Louis Weichmann, the boarder, told his house tour again, polished by 2 years of retelling. The core of the government's case against the son was, almost line for line, the same material that had hanged the mother, delivered by the same mouths. And watch what happened to those 2 men when the room changed. In front of the military commission, Lloyd and Weichmann had been almost unassailable, because the commission wanted to believe them, and the defense could barely lay a hand on them. In a civilian court, in front of a real judge, under real rules, defense lawyers, who were not afraid of being called traitors, took the same two witnesses apart. They dug into what Lloyd had been on that Good Friday, drunk since morning, and into the plain fact that he had testified with his own neck in a noose. They dug into Weichmann's own tangled position, a War Department clerk who had lived inside the conspiracy's house and been threatened with prosecution himself before he became the government's model witness. The same testimony that had sounded like proof before 9 officers sounded, in front of 12 citizens, like exactly what it was: the uncorroborated memory of 2 compromised men. But this time there were 12 jurors instead of 9 officers. This time, the defense could cross-examine without a colonel ruling on its patriotism. This time, the accused's lawyers could put the government's pressure on its own witnesses squarely in front of the room. And this time, when the defense showed the jury Elmira, hotel registers, a tailor's records, witnesses who put the defendant 400 miles from the theater, the room was legally obliged to care. The jury got the case in August, deliberated for 3 days, and came back hopelessly split. 8 for acquittal, 4 for conviction, a hung jury, a mistrial. Read those numbers again slowly, because they are the quiet center of this whole story. 2/3 of a civilian jury, hearing substantially the government's same witnesses about the same conspiracy, voted not guilty. And they did it for the man who had actually plotted with Booth for months, recruited the muscle, stashed the carbines, and confessed the kidnapping with his own mouth for years afterward. His mother, who confessed nothing, whose guilt lived entirely in 2 remembered sentences, had faced 9 officers instead. To live, she needed 4 of the 9 to hold out against death. She did not get them. And the cruelest part of the arithmetic is this: 5 officers signed a plea begging the president to spare her, and those same 5 had voted for the rope first. 4 of them, voting no on death instead of yes, would have saved her life in the room. They chose to convict her and beg for mercy afterward, and left the killing to a president who said he never got the letter. The government could have retried John Surratt. It looked at its cards and folded. By the following summer, the murder charge was dead. The remaining charge had run out its statute of limitations, and in the summer of 1868, the prosecution entered the Latin phrase that ends a case without a verdict: nolle prosequi, we will not pursue. John Surratt walked out of court into the Washington sunshine, 31 months after the assassination, a free man for the rest of a long life. No prison, no fine, nothing. The United States government executed exactly 1 member of the Surratt family for the Lincoln conspiracy. It was not the Confederate agent who rode with Booth for 6 months. It was his landlady mother, on an 1/8 of his evidence, because she drew the military room and he drew the civilian one, and the 23 months between their arrests happened to contain the Supreme Court decision that said her room should never have existed. There is no cleaner controlled experiment in American legal history, and no colder one. And the freed man still had one performance left in him. On the 6th of December, 1870, 5 years after his mother's body dropped through a scaffold floor, John Surratt Jr. walked onto a stage in a courthouse in Rockville, Maryland. He sold tickets, and he told a paying audience the story of how he had plotted to kidnap Abraham Lincoln. He had become a lecturer. The plan was a tour. A man with his history could fill a hall, and he needed money, and so the son of Mary Surratt stood under the lamps in a rented courtroom and performed the conspiracy as an adventure. He talked for an hour and a quarter. He described meeting Booth. He described the famous actor leaning in close and whispering the plan, that they would seize the president and carry him to Richmond. He described his own hesitation, and then, in his own remembered words, the surrender to it. After 2 days' reflection, he said, "I told him I was willing to try it." He walked the audience through the safe houses and the couriers and the failed ambush on the 7th Street Road, and he told it, by every account of the evening, with relish. A young man's war story, dusted off for the footlights. There is one subject the lecture handled carefully: his mother. He insisted, from the stage, that she had known nothing. He insisted he was innocent of the murder, that the kidnapping was a soldier's scheme against a wartime commander, and that the assassination had been Booth's private madness that he learned about, like the rest of the country, from a newspaper. On the central fact of his own life, that he had run north while she was tried and hanged in his place, the lecture had less to say. Think about what this actually was. The man whose conspiracy had put the carbines above Lloyd's kitchen, whose friendship had brought Booth to the H Street parlor, whose name in the newspapers had turned his mother's boarding house into a nest, was now charging admission to describe it. The evidence that could not be assembled to save her, he was handing out for free, from a stage, for a fee. The country's stomach turned. His next lecture was announced for Washington itself, the city where his mother was buried a few miles from the hall. Public outrage killed it before he could give it. Citizens who had lived through the assassination would not sit and watch the escaped Surratt profit from the season of the crime. The Washington lecture was canceled. The tour collapsed inside a month. John Surratt, who had outrun cavalry and prison and a hangman, could not outrun the disgust of a room, and he quietly stopped performing and disappeared into an ordinary life. He lived almost 50 more years. He married, raised 7 children, taught school, and worked as a clerk and an auditor for a steamship company in Baltimore. He died in 1916, past 70, in his own bed, of natural causes, an old man who had once worn the uniform of the Pope and jumped off a wall in Italy to keep from hanging for the crime his mother was hanged for. He is buried in Baltimore, under a normal stone, with normal dates. He got the whole long, unremarkable life the government took from her. So we have the sun, now the ledger. Turn back to the sheet of paper. 5 officers, a majority of the court that condemned her, signing their names under a plea that Andrew Johnson spare Mary Surratt's life. That sheet went up the chain, sewn into the trial record. Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt carried the record to the White House on the 5th of July. Johnson signed the death warrant. 2 days later she hanged, and for the rest of their lives, the 2 men who had been alone in that room told 2 stories that cannot both be true. Johnson's story never changed. He swore he was never shown the petition. He said that if Holt had placed that plea in front of him, signed by 5 of his own commissioners, he would have weighed it, and that Holt carried the record in and out of that room and never let those signatures reach his eyes. In Johnson's account, he approved a woman's death in ignorance of the fact that most of the court that sentenced her had begged for her life. Holt's story never changed either. He swore the exact opposite. He said he laid the petition in front of the president that afternoon, that Johnson read it, and that Johnson dismissed it with the remark that she had kept the nest that hatched the plot and must reap the consequences. In Holt's account, the mercy plea was seen at the highest level, considered and refused, and the guilt for refusing it belonged entirely to the man who held the pen. One of them lied. There is no third witness. So do what a jury does when there is no third witness. Look at what each man stood to lose. Johnson had the presidency to protect. Within 2 years he was impeached, tried in the Senate, and saved from removal by a single vote. A president already fighting for his political life could not afford to be the man who signed a woman's death warrant while spurning the written mercy of her own judges. If that story took hold, it would follow him into history as exactly the kind of cruelty his enemies already accused him of. Johnson had every reason on earth to say he never saw the paper. Holt had something narrower and, to a proud man, worse. Holt was the machine of the whole prosecution. He had chosen the military commission, guided its rules, and pushed its verdicts. If the petition never reached Johnson, then the one man who could have carried 5 generals' mercy to the one desk that mattered and buried it instead was Joseph Holt. He would be the man who hanged a woman his own court tried to save. For a lawyer who saw himself as the guardian of the Union's justice, that was not a political problem. It was damnation. And here the record tips its hand, just slightly. The petition physically survived, sewn into the file, in Holt's custody the whole time. Johnson went to his grave insisting on his innocence, and was never contradicted by paper. Holt spent the rest of his life, decades of it, not simply denying the charge, but waging war on it. He gathered affidavits. He hunted down cabinet members to swear they had seen the petition on Johnson's desk. And in 1873, he published a pamphlet, at his own expense, with a title that tells you everything about the state of the man. A vindication of Judge Advocate General Holt from the foul slanders of traitors, confessed perjurers, and suborners. Men who are certain of their innocence rarely spend 8 years in a printed pamphlet screaming it. Holt died a bitter recluse, barricaded in a Washington house, still fighting a fight that no verdict would ever end. The historian's honest verdict is that the truth cannot be recovered, that the paper is genuinely lost between 2 dead men. The reader's verdict is allowed to be quieter and colder, and to notice which of the 2 men could not stop talking. That is the ledger. It does not balance. It was never going to balance. A woman is just as dead whether the president refused her judge's mercy or never learned it existed. The 5 signatures are the truest thing in the whole file, because they are the one place where men inside the machine looked at what they were doing to Mary Surratt, and too late and too weakly flinched. Now, the 2 men on the staircase. Remember them. The senator from Kansas and the former senator from New York, who stood at the foot of the White House stairs and turned Anna Surratt away when she came, twice, to beg for her mother's life. James Lane, Preston King, the president's gatekeepers. Their part in this story was 30 seconds long. A hand raised at a stair. A weeping girl refused. Watch what the record does with them. Preston King, the New Yorker, drowned himself first. 4 months after the hanging, in November of 1865, King boarded a ferry on the Hudson River, tied a bag of bullets around his own neck, and stepped off into the water. He was a heavy, troubled man, crushed by the patronage post Johnson had given him, and the weight he chose to carry into the river was a sack of lead. He went straight down. James Lane, the Kansan, lasted 8 months longer. In the summer of 1866, riding in a carriage near Fort Leavenworth, Lane called out a cheerful goodbye to his brother-in-law, put the muzzle of a pistol into his own mouth, and fired. He lingered 10 days and died. He had backed Johnson, lost his friends, and come apart under rumor and disgrace. both gatekeepers of that staircase, dead by their own hands inside a year of the woman they helped keep from mercy. History does not draw the line for you. It does not have to. It simply lays the three deaths side by side and lets you sit with the arrangement. A widow on a scaffold in July, a drowned man in November, a shot man the following summer. Make of the pattern what your conscience makes of it. And then there are the men who were convicted beside her. Remember them, because their fates finish the argument. 4 of the 8 were not sentenced to death, but to prison, shipped to a fortress on a reef in the Gulf called Fort Jefferson, 70 miles out to sea. Dr. Mudd, who set Booth's leg, Arnold and O'Loughlin, the 2 who had signed on for the kidnapping and quit, Spangler, the stagehand. Out on that reef, in 1867, yellow fever swept the fort, and the prison doctor died, and Samuel Mudd, the convicted conspirator, took over the sick ward and worked the epidemic until it broke. O'Loughlin caught the fever and died there, and the other 3, Mudd, Arnold, and Spangler, were pardoned. Andrew Johnson signed their pardons in the last weeks of his presidency. In the same February, he finally released Mary Surratt's body. Sit with that sequence one more time. The government could reconsider. It could look again at the men it had convicted in that same room, on that same tide of grief, and decide that mercy was warranted, and set them free to go home. It reconsidered for the doctor who touched Booth's body. It reconsidered for the 2 men who joined the actual kidnapping plot. What it could not reconsider, because it had settled the matter in 81 days with a rope, was the one defendant it had already killed. You cannot pardon a hanged woman. That is the practical genius of speed. Move fast enough, and there is nothing left to reconsider. That is what became of the men. It is time to go back, one last time, to the woman. They took her down from the scaffold in the late afternoon of the 7th of July, and they buried her that same day, a few steps from where she fell, in a pine box in the prison yard, beside the 3 men she died with. For almost 4 years she lay in the dirt of the arsenal, unmarked, in ground the army controlled, while her daughter Anna wrote letter after letter begging for the body. In February of 1869, Andrew Johnson, in the last days of his broken presidency, finally signed the release. The remains of Mary Surratt were dug out of the prison yard and carried across the city to a Catholic cemetery, Mount Olivet, and lowered into consecrated ground at last. It sat near the edge of the city she had come to in the last winter of the war, to open a boarding house and start again. Her children buried her there. In time, Anna was laid on one side of her, and Isaac, the Confederate son, on the other. The family closed around the mother, in the ground the way it never quite managed to close around her in life. Go to that grave today, and you will find, over the first woman the United States government ever executed, one of the smallest markers in the cemetery, a low, plain stone, no dates, no verse, no defense, 2 words, Mrs. Surratt. That is all it says. Not the name the newspapers gave her, the she-devil of H Street. Not the martyr the pamphlets made of her later. Not guilty, not innocent, not the widow, not the conspirator. Just the honorific of a married woman. The thing she was before any of it. The thing the debt and the boarding house and the buggy rides and the 9 officers and the 2 remembered sentences were supposed to have been about. Mrs. Surratt. A respectable woman's name on a small stone, over a body the army held for 4 years. And then the country did the thing it does best, with the people it is not proud of. It forgot her. Think of the other American woman, famous for a killing in that same century. Lizzie Borden, tried for the axe murder of her father and stepmother, acquitted, and turned into a nursery rhyme that schoolchildren still chant. Lizzie Borden walked free and became folklore. Mary Surratt was hanged by her own government on the thinnest evidence in the whole conspiracy and became almost nothing, no rhyme, no legend, a footnote to Booth, a name in the caption of a grim photograph, a small stone in a Washington cemetery that most visitors walk straight past. That is the last quiet cruelty of this story, and it is worth naming because forgetting is its own kind of verdict. A country that had hanged a woman it was not sure was guilty had every reason to let her fade, and it did. The cleaner story, the one where the government caught the killers and justice was done, only holds together if you do not look too hard at the widow on the left side of the photograph. So the country did not look. For 160 years, mostly, it still has not. 81 days. That is the number to end on, the way we began on it. 81 days, from the knock on her door to the umbrella in the yard. 53 days of trial, in a room where she was forbidden to speak. 9 officers, of whom she needed 3, and got, so far as history can tell, not one. 5 signatures asking for her life, on a sheet of paper that either a president ignored or a prosecutor hid. 1 daughter, turned away at a staircase. 1 son in a village in Quebec, reading the newspaper, staying exactly where he was, and 2 years later, in a different room, with 12 jurors instead of 9 officers, that same son tried on much of that same evidence, walked out into the sunlight, and lived to be an old man. The government hanged the one who kept the house. It could not convict the one who ran the plot, and the only difference the record can find between them, the whole difference, the difference between a rope and a long, quiet life, is which courtroom the calendar happened to put them in. The umbrella in the photograph is folded now. The soldiers on the wall have stopped swinging their legs, and on a small stone in a Washington cemetery, under 2 plain words, lies the answer to a question the United States has never been willing to ask out loud, not whether Mary Surratt was a good woman. The record cannot fully settle that, and this account has not pretended to. The question is whether the case that killed her could ever have killed her son. 2 juries answered it. 1 was allowed to, 1 was not.